The courtroom was filled with an eerie silence. Not the usual silence before a trial, but a heavy tension that hung over everyone. It felt like the air had been sucked out, making every breath difficult. The source of this tension came from the wheelchair at the front of the room. In the wheelchair sat Sergeant Ryan Carter, a decorated veteran. He wore a uniform with badges and ribbons that told the story of countless missions and sacrifices. He had lost part of his right leg, the result of a terrible accident on the battlefield, and now had to move around in a wheelchair. But it was not him who drew all eyes, but the German Shepherd beside him. Charlie, Ryan's service dog, lay peacefully, but everyone could sense the alertness radiating from him. Charlie's ears twitched at the slightest sound in the room. As the clock ticked toward the official start of the hearing, a slight tremor, either from excitement or anxiety, seemed to run through the dog. Ryan reached out and stroked Charlie's neck, a gesture that was both comforting and reassuring. Ryan's jaw tightened as the judge spoke to him, reminding him that this might be his last chance to speak. The Army had determined that Charlie would be reassigned as government property needed for another mission. The room grew quieter as Ryan spoke. His voice was hoarse, like that of someone who had spent years screaming over helicopters and artillery fire. He reached down and gently scratched Charlie behind the ears. "Charlie is more than just a tool of the military," he said. "He saved my life in ways that no one here can understand. On the battlefield, it pulled me out of danger, shielded me from bullets, even warned me of traps before I could see them. It was the reason I was alive, the light that kept me going through the nightmares that had never really left me since I returned from the battlefield." There was a quiet determination in Ryan's eyes. As a decorated veteran, he had seen enough of the battlefield to know that loyalty could mean survival. Charlie, patiently but vigilantly standing by his side, was living proof of that. The atmosphere in the room grew heavier as emotion rose in Ryan's voice. He told him that Charlie had not only saved him from danger on the battlefield, but had continued to be his support through the invisible mental wounds, anxiety, guilt, and post-traumatic stress. Those are the real demons Ryan must face, and Charlie is by his side every step of the way. Ryan took a deep breath, his voice beginning to shake with urgency as he continued. "Sir, I don't just need Charlie to get over my battle wounds. I need him to prove that the chemical attack I survived wasn't an accident." Heads turned in the courtroom, a low murmur spreading through the crowd. The idea that Ryan's chemical attack might have been intentional wasn't entirely new to some, but hearing him say it so clearly in the solemn atmosphere of the courtroom, the assertion suddenly felt heavier than ever. Ryan's fingers were white from gripping the armrests of his wheelchair. "Charlie was there," he continued, letting the emotion in his voice betray the weight of what he was saying. "He knew, or rather, he could detect traces of what I was exposed to. Charlie is living proof that someone deliberately orchestrated that attack, and it was not just a random accident." As soon as Ryan finished speaking, the judge raised a hand, about to ask something more. But right then, something unexpected happened. Charlie suddenly bolted upright, yanking the leash from Ryan's trembling hands. The dog charged toward the judge, barking fiercely, his voice echoing through the courtroom. The crowd gasped, some flinching, while the bailiffs instinctively stepped forward. Yet Charlie didn't seem aggressive. His barks were sharp and deliberate, as if he were trying to convey something urgent. "Charlie!" Ryan shouted, his voice cracking with panic. Deep down, though, he knew. He'd seen this behavior from Charlie dozens of times on the battlefield. Charlie wasn't just barking for no reason. He was warning them. The murmurs in the room grew louder. "What's wrong with that dog?" someone whispered from the back row. Ryan's chest tightened as he wheeled himself forward, his voice shaky. "He's not just barking. He only does this when there's danger. He's trying to warn us." The judge froze, his gavel forgotten in his hand, his eyes locked on Charlie. The room fell silent again, save for Charlie's barks ringing out like a pounding heartbeat. For Ryan, a flicker of hope sparked for the first time that day. This wasn't just a goodbye. Something bigger was about to unfold, and Charlie was dead set on making everyone see it. Charlie's barking didn't let up, each sharp sound bouncing off the courtroom's dark wooden walls, slicing through the thick tension like a blade. He crouched low, his body rigid, ears pinned back, and eyes fixed on the judge's bench. Ryan gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, his heart racing. This wasn't random barking. He knew Charlie's body language too well. The dog had sensed something dangerous. Adrenaline surged through him, just like it had in those battlefield moments. Even though this was a courtroom, a place supposed to be safe. "Charlie, come!" Ryan called, his voice firm but trembling. Charlie flicked a quick glance back at him, his sharp gaze almost reassuring, then turned right back, pacing short, careful steps in front of the judge's bench. The barks shifted into deep, guttural growls that sent shivers through the room. The crowd started whispering anxiously, their earlier sympathy for Ryan now turning into obvious unease. "Mr. Carter," the judge said, irritation creeping into his tone, "control your dog or I'll have to—" "Your Honor," Ryan cut in, his voice louder and steadier despite the fear gripping his chest. "Charlie's not misbehaving. He's trained to detect danger, bombs, chemicals, anything threatening. He wouldn't act like this unless something's wrong." Ryan's words silenced the room once more. The initial skepticism gave way to a creeping fear that spread like wildfire. Then out of nowhere, Charlie stopped barking. The sudden quiet was deafening. His body went stiff, his head snapping toward the back of the courtroom, ears perked straight up, a low, menacing growl rumbling from his chest. The shift was so abrupt, so intense, that even the judge froze in place. Every eye turned to the far end of the room, where Charlie's gaze was locked. Ryan's breathing quickened, his pulse pounding in his ears. He'd seen Charlie act like this before, minutes before the dog sniffed out a bomb or signaled an enemy ambush on the battlefield. "Charlie," he whispered, his voice shaky. "What is it?" Charlie didn't budge, his growl deepening, vibrating through the air like a warning. Whatever Charlie sensed, it wasn't just a threat to Ryan. It was danger for everyone in that room. The low growl from Charlie rolled on, like distant thunder, pinning everyone in their spots. His eyes stayed fixed on the back of the room. The judge, who moments ago had been ready to scold Ryan, now looked rattled, his gavel still clutched but forgotten in his hand. He exchanged nervous glances with the bailiffs. The air felt charged, heavy with a tension no one could put into words. Ryan's breath came faster, his hands gripping the armrests of his wheelchair, as if bracing for an explosion. He knew Charlie's instincts had always been the line between life and death. "Stay calm," he muttered to himself, but the words rang hollow. A bailiff, a big guy with a wary expression, stepped forward, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. "It's just a dog, right?" he mumbled, though his voice betrayed his unease, probably reacting to the noise or the crowd. But his steps were slow, cautious. Ryan shook his head, his voice rising enough to cut through the murmurs. "No, Charlie doesn't react to noise or people like that. He's trained to sense danger, things we can't see. Trust me, if he's growling like this, there's a reason." His words hung in the air. The judge, visibly shaken, finally nodded, signaling the bailiffs to check the back of the room. Charlie's growls grew louder as they approached. He stood still, body taut, then suddenly let out a series of sharp barks. Ryan's heart raced faster, and he leaned forward, his chest tight with dread. Something had set Charlie off, and Ryan knew one thing for sure. Charlie was never wrong. The air in the room grew heavier, as if the tension itself was draining the oxygen, leaving only Charlie's echoing barks, his body poised to face a threat no one else could see. Every eye in the room turned to the man at the back of the courtroom. He stood up, but instead of showing fear or worry, he gave a faint smile, almost mocking. He began clapping slowly, each clap ringing out clearly in the hushed wooden space. "Impressive," he said deliberately, his voice calm but hollow. "They told me this dog was special. Now I see they were right." The slow clapping stopped as he slipped his hands into his pockets. His gaze lingered on Charlie for a moment before shifting to Ryan. There was a chilling coldness in his eyes that sent a shiver down Ryan's spine. He recognized that look. It stirred a terrifying memory. The bailiffs stepped closer, their uniforms brushing against the seats as they spoke. "Sir, identify yourself and explain why you're here." Their hands hovered near their holsters, a silent warning that they'd act if necessary. Still wearing that faint smile, the man slowly pulled one hand from his pocket. In his palm was a small glass vial, no bigger than a thumb, filled with a pale green liquid. The overhead lights hit the vial, making the liquid glow with an eerie shimmer. Instantly, Charlie erupted into fierce barking. Not the usual kind, but a wild, furious sound. The German Shepherd bared his teeth, clearly reacting to whatever was in that vial, a sign that it was anything but ordinary. "Sergeant Carter, no need to panic," the man said, his voice eerily calm, cutting through Charlie's thunderous barks. "I brought this as a gift, a little reminder of what you saw in that explosion, of what you survived." His tone was ice cold, each word slicing through the tense air. Then, without warning, he hurled the vial to the floor. It shattered, releasing a thin, pale mist that quickly spread across the room. As the thin, pale smoke began to fill the courtroom, the already tense atmosphere erupted into chaos. The sound of chairs toppling over clattered through the room, mixing with the panicked screams of the crowd and the harsh coughing as the smoke seeped into every corner. Amid the madness, Charlie suddenly whipped around, his sharp eyes blazing with determination. With a powerful tug on the leash, the dog yanked Ryan's wheelchair back, away from the spreading haze. Charlie's strength sent the wheels rolling fast across the floor, the tires screeching against the polished surface. Ryan felt each of his rapid breaths as the pungent smell of chemicals rushed into his nose. A pungent, burning smell, like fire burning his throat. Memories of the chemical attack from years ago flooded back, so vivid he could hear the explosions in his mind and feel the heat searing his skin. A cold wave of fear shot down his spine, making his hands tremble as he gripped Charlie's leash tighter. He let Charlie take the lead, trusting the dog's instincts completely. Around him, the scene unfolded like a nightmare. Wooden chairs lay scattered across the floor, overturned in the chaos. Reporters who'd come to capture Ryan's heartfelt story now scrambled toward the emergency exits in a panic, papers and pens dropping everywhere. The spectators shoved and pushed each other, their faces pale with terror, eyes watering from the smoke. A middle-aged woman screamed as she tripped and fell, while a young reporter tried to snap photos while running, only to double over, coughing violently from the fumes. The mix of hacking coughs and desperate shouts formed a chaotic symphony, making the air feel even more suffocating. Charlie pressed close to Ryan, his solid frame like a living shield. With steady, purposeful steps, the dog pulled Ryan across the slick floor, ears upright, eyes fixed ahead. Ryan could sense the resolve in his companion. This wasn't the first time Charlie had saved him from danger. But this time, alongside the fear churning in his gut, a fiery anger surged within him. He looked up, his gaze icy and piercing, searching for the mysterious man. The figure was calmly heading toward a side door, his silhouette fading into the smoke. Then a chilling voice cut through the air. "We'll be back for the dog." It wasn't loud, but it echoed as if amplified by the silence of fear itself. It wasn't just a warning, it was a clear threat, one that made Ryan feel his blood turn to ice. He blinked, straining to see more, but the door slammed shut. The man was gone, leaving behind a heavy sense of dread that settled over everything. Finally, everyone rushed out into the wide hallway outside the courtroom. The air outside was cool, a far cry from the stuffiness inside, but there was still a faint smell of chemicals. Court staff, their faces flushed with panic, rushed to support the judge. The old man, who had always maintained a dignified demeanor, was now panting, clutching his chest, his eyes watering from the smoke. A young staff member shouted for help, while another raised his sleeve to wipe sweat from the judge's forehead, his voice trembling. "Are you okay? Do you need water?" The reporters, who had just escaped danger, quickly gathered near a nearby wall, cameras and phones in hand, recording the chaotic scene. One of them, his hair disheveled from running away, muttered to his colleague, "What the hell just happened? What was that bottle?" But no one had an answer. Ryan sat still in his wheelchair, holding Charlie tightly to his chest. His heart was pounding, not just from the adrenaline, but from the sheer awareness of the danger. He bent down, gently placing his hand on Charlie's neck, feeling the dog's rapid breathing and the heaving of his flanks from the tremendous effort. Charlie let out a small whimper, resting his head against Ryan's leg, his dark brown eyes looking at him as if to say that everything was okay, for now at least. The dog was no longer barking or growling, but the tension was still there, in every stiff muscle of its body. Ryan stroked Charlie's fur, whispering, "Thank you, my friend." His voice was hoarse, filled with both gratitude and lingering fear. The stranger's threat still echoed in his head. "We'll be back for the dog." It was like a ghost, haunting his every thought, keeping him from relaxing even though the danger had temporarily passed. A sheriff stepped forward, his leather boots clicking on the cold stone floor. He stopped in front of Ryan, his face still dazed, his hands shaking slightly as they rested on his belt. "Sergeant," he asked softly, his voice full of concern, "are you okay? Do you need a doctor?" Ryan looked up, shaking his head slowly. "No," he replied, his voice hoarse with smoke and emotion. He narrowed his eyes, his gaze distant, as if he were thinking about something. "But I know they'll come back for Charlie. This isn't over yet." The sheriff nodded, his expression solemn. He turned to look at the crowd that was still whispering around him. People were emerging from the courtroom in small groups, whispering about the stranger and the pale green liquid in the vial. An elderly reporter, clutching a crumpled notebook, muttered to the man next to him, "Who is he? Is that the thing in the vial that attacked him all those years ago?" An old woman sitting nearby, clutching her handbag, whispered to the person next to her, "I've never seen anything so terrifying in my life." Fear and curiosity permeated the air, but no one dared to speak loudly, as if afraid that if they mentioned the stranger, he would return immediately. Ryan looked down at Charlie, the dog still pressed against him, his breathing slowing. He knew that even though they had escaped today, the shadow of the threat still lurked somewhere, waiting for the next opportunity. Anger and determination rose inside him. Whoever it was, they would never separate him and Charlie. They were a team, and they would face it all together. After the chaos, court officers and bailiffs quickly cordoned off the area. Yellow tape was put up, transforming the normally solemn courtroom into a crime scene. Investigators emerged, men in dark suits, badges on their belts, and began peppering witnesses with questions. Ryan had to answer, but his mind couldn't focus. He kept thinking about the moment the mysterious man mentioned the gift. He knew deep down, the gift had to do with the chemical attack he'd endured years ago. Charlie's violent reaction to the vial of liquid only confirmed it. The dog recognized the familiar chemical scent from his past. Ryan's eyes were hard and determined. "They didn't just want Charlie," he said, his voice low but firm. "They wanted to destroy him. Charlie and I, we are living proof that the attack I survived was not accidental, but intentional. Now it seems that someone is trying to silence us so that the truth never comes out." News of the incident spread quickly through the courthouse hallways. A clerk stepped forward, her voice shaking as she announced, "The trial is adjourned until further notice." She banged her gavel on the table, her hands still shaking from what had just happened. "We will reschedule once the investigation into that man is complete." To Ryan, the adjournment no longer mattered. He understood that this had gone beyond a simple court case. It was now a fight for survival. If what he suspected was true, that powerful people wanted to cover up the truth about the chemical attack, then things had only just begun. As the police escorted him down the hallway, Charlie led the way, reporters swarming around him. Cameras flashed, microphones were pointed, and voices shouted, "Sergeant Carter, who is that man? What do you know about this plot?" But the noise only made Ryan more confused. He fell silent, his mind racing with thoughts. Finally, he was led into a small, quiet room, an office where officials would meet or report. There, a stern-looking military officer waited. He wore a camouflage uniform with a name tag on his chest that read, "Griffin." He regarded Ryan with a mixture of respect. "Sergeant Carter," he said, his voice deep and steady, "we have reason to believe that Charlie is part of a secret Department of Defense program that specializes in detecting chemical weapons. His training is unlike any other K-9 unit, far beyond the norm, and now we suspect that someone is trying to erase all traces of this program, especially dogs like Charlie." Ryan looked down at Charlie. The dog watched the conversation silently, his ears twitching at the strain in their voices. "I won't let them have him," Ryan said, his voice hard and firm. "If some shady group wants to wipe us out, to bury the truth of what happened, I'll fight to the end." Griffin let out a sigh of relief, as if he'd anticipated Ryan's determination. I knew you'd say that, but you need to understand how dangerous this group is. The one who showed up in court today should be a small warning. According to intelligence, there's a network trying to recover all the technology and living assets from that secret program. Charlie is the last piece they need to replicate or perfect the advanced chemical detection technique. If they catch him or kill him so no one else can use him, they'll wipe out all traces. Ryan's heart pounded in his chest. He had faced danger on the battlefield, where the enemy was visible in uniform and banners. But this threat was different. It was hidden in the shadows, in plain sight, ready to use poison in public. That made it all the more terrifying. How do we stop them? He asked bluntly. Griffin hesitated. We don't have many resources. I can arrange for protection to get you and Charlie to safety. But if they're truly determined, they'll find you wherever you are. Your most powerful weapon is the truth, to make public their existence and their cover-up of the chemical attack. Ryan nodded. He remembered the look the man in the courtroom had given Charlie. Not just hostility, but hunger. The sky began to darken, and the building grew quiet as the chaos died down. The long hallways were dark, the lights casting long shadows across the tiled floors. Ryan returned to the now empty courtroom, away from the reporters and investigators still milling about outside. Charlie was by his side, as always. Ryan ran a hand through the thick fur at the back of the dog's neck. He could feel the alertness in Charlie's every move. Normally, after a confrontation, Charlie would relax when the danger had passed. But this time, the dog was tense, as if he knew the real threat was still there, not gone. Ryan whispered softly, "It's okay, buddy. We'll get through this." Charlie's ears perked up at the sound of his voice. The dog slowly leaned closer to Ryan, and he could feel Charlie's strong heartbeat, a warm comfort in the midst of the storm. Without that unshakable bond, Ryan might have felt lost in the unknown. But with Charlie by his side, he found the strength to face whatever awaited him. Outside the courthouse, the sky was slowly turning from a brilliant orange to the soft pink of dusk. The street lamps came on one by one, a pale yellow light falling on the cold stone steps, where a few reporters lingered patiently. They stood in small groups, whispering to each other, cameras and phones in hand, their eyes filled with curiosity and worry. A long day was coming to an end, but no one left with a sense of relief. The events that had just happened in the courtroom still had a heavy aftertaste. For Ryan, as he sat in his wheelchair by the main door, the feeling was even more clear. The day was over, but his battle with Charlie had only just begun. He looked down at Charlie, the dog lying close to his feet, its ears twitching as if listening for the slightest sound. Charlie's dark brown eyes were calm, but Ryan knew the strength and alertness behind them. Memories of his days on the battlefield flooded back to him, as vivid as if they had happened yesterday. The times they had crossed the line together, the bullets whistling overhead, the bombs exploding, the cold nights in the bunker, when Charlie's breathing was the only thing keeping him conscious through the pain of his wounds. He remembered the time Charlie pulled him out of a burning armored vehicle, through the thick smoke and the constant explosions. He remembered the days after the war, when the darkness of memory weighed heavily on his soul, and Charlie lay beside him, silent but enough to remind him that he was not alone. Through it all, Charlie had never wavered, never left him. "Whatever comes next," Ryan said, his voice low and sure, as if he were telling himself to gain courage for the days ahead, "we will face it together. We have been through too much to let anyone tear us apart." The words were not just a pledge to Charlie, but an oath to himself. There was the steely determination of a soldier who had faced death, but also a hint of trepidation in his voice, not out of fear for himself, but out of concern for the companion who had become his everything. Charlie looked up at him, his breath coming out in small puffs in the cool evening air. The dog's eyes were calm, a silent response, and unwavering loyalty radiated from every movement. He tilted his head slightly, leaning closer to Ryan's leg, as if to say, "I'm here, as I always am." That moment, in the silence outside the courthouse, sent a surge of warmth through Ryan. He felt his heart pounding, not out of fear, but out of the conviction that with Charlie by his side, he could face anything. be it a cold bureaucracy or an invisible enemy willing to do anything to bury the truth. The future was hazy, with no clear signs. Ryan's enemy remained a mystery. No name, no face, only a cold threat echoing in his head. "We'll be back for the dog." But the bond between Ryan Carter and Charlie was unbreakable. He placed his hand on Charlie's head, feeling the soft fur beneath his calloused palms, and a feeling of certainty rose within him. They were a team, and nothing could change that. Subscribe, like, and comment below if you want to hear the next part of the story. What will Ryan and Charlie discover, and who will be next to emerge from the shadows?